In the summer of 2015, a group of researchers stood on the edge of a vast wetland wilderness in western Alaska, watching the sky. They were waiting for a sound most people alive today have never heard: the low rumble of a C-130 military cargo aircraft, carrying something that once defined an entire continent. When the plane finally touched down on a gravel strip near the remote village of Shageluk, and the loading ramp lowered and the animals inside blinked into the Alaskan light for the first time, one of the biologists later described the moment as the kind of thing that makes you reconsider every assumption you have ever held about how broken the natural world actually is, and how much of it can still be put back together. They had flown 100 wood bison into the Innoko River Valley, a landscape that had not seen a single one of these animals in over 100 years. And what those bison proceeded to do, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, and with a biological intelligence built over millions of years of evolution, would eventually force researchers to rewrite their understanding of what large animals actually do to the land beneath their feet. To understand why this moment mattered as much as it did, you have to go back. Not just 100 years, but to a time when the North American continent was a fundamentally different place. Before the 19th century, before the rifles and the railroad and the systematic machinery of American westward expansion, somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison roamed this continent. Let that number sit for a moment. 60 million. Animals, each one weighing up to a ton, moving in herds so vast that early explorers described them as covering the earth from horizon to horizon like a slow brown tide. They shaped the Great Plains, not metaphorically, but literally. The grasslands of North America were not just the backdrop for the bison. They were in large part a creation of the bison, sculpted over thousands of generations by grazing, by trampling, by wallowing, by the weight and movement and biological output of millions of enormous bodies passing over the same ground year after year after year. Then, in the space of roughly 50 years, almost all of them were gone. Heath's slaughter of the American bison in the 19th century is one of the most staggering ecological events in recorded history. What happened was not accidental, and it was not purely commercial, though commerce played a major role. Hide hunters working in organized teams of sharpshooters and skinners moved across the Great Plains in waves, killing hundreds of animals a day, leaving the carcasses to rot in the sun while they stripped the hides and moved on. By one historical account from 1886, a National Museum expedition sent to Montana specifically to collect specimens from the remaining wild herds found no more than 30 living bison in the entire state, and only 1,073 across all of North America. From 60 million to 1,000 in less than a lifetime. The Great Plains were described in those years as an open-air industrial slaughterhouse, with bones piled so thick in some areas that settlers collected and sold them by the wagon load as fertilizer. The devastation was not accidental. The U.S. government understood with brutal clarity that the bison and the indigenous peoples of the plains were bound together in a relationship so deep and so functional that destroying one meant destroying the other. Bison were the food supply, the clothing, the tools, the spiritual center, and the economic foundation of plains indigenous life. Every part of the animal was used. The hide became shelter and clothing. The meat fed families. Through brutal winters, the bones became tools, the sinew became rope, the stomach lining served as a cooking vessel. General Philip Sheridan, the Union Army officer who oversaw the destruction, reportedly told the Texas legislature that the hide hunters were doing more to solve what the government called the Indian problem than the entire U.S. Army had managed in 30 years. They were not just killing animals. They were deliberately severing a civilization from its foundation. By 1902, fewer than 100 wild bison remained on the continent. The animal that had defined the landscape of half a nation had been functionally erased in the time it takes a person to grow old. The grasslands that had been maintained by their presence for thousands of years began to change immediately. Without the bison to graze them in the particular way that only bison graze, the plant communities shifted. Without the wallows, those distinctive depressions that bison create by rolling their enormous bodies in the earth, the small wetlands and pools those wallows had formed across the plains began to disappear. Without the constant movement of millions of bodies across the soil, without the nutrient cycling from their dung, without the complex web of relationships between the bison and the birds and the insects and the microbes and the plants that had evolved alongside them, the Great Plains became something different. Not immediately, not all at once, but inexorably. Which is why, when a group of biologists in Alaska loaded 100 wood bison onto a military cargo plane in 2015, the scientific stakes were considerably larger than the headlines suggested. Wood bison are different from their plains cousins in ways that matter. They are bigger, the largest land mammal in North America, with bulls reaching nearly 2,000 pounds. They are adapted specifically to the cold landscapes of the northern interior, to deep snow and long winters and the particular ecology of subarctic wetlands and grasslands. And they had their own story of near extinction and improbable survival. Wood bison were essentially considered extinct in the wild through most of the 20th century, until a small herd was discovered in a remote area of northern Canada in the 1950s. That remnant population became the foundation of a careful breeding program. By the time the Alaska project was ready to proceed, a source population at Elk Island National Park in Alberta had been maintained specifically to provide animals for a reintroduction across the original range, a range that once included large areas of interior Alaska. The process of getting those bison to Alaska was not simple. It required years of regulatory work, community consultation with Alaska Native villages whose lands bordered the reintroduction area, agreements between the U.S. and Canadian governments, and the construction of a specialized breeding facility at the Robert G. White Large Animal Research Station near Fairbanks. The animals arrived from Canada as calves, spent months being monitored and health checked, were loaded into custom shipping containers, transported by truck and then by barge down the Yukon River, and finally released into a soft pen in the Inaco River Valley, where they were allowed to acclimatize before the fencing was removed, and they stepped for the first time into a landscape that their ancestors had not touched in over 100 years. What happened over the following years was not the dramatic, immediate transformation that makes for clean television. It was something more interesting and more complicated than that. The bison struggled at first. Alaskan winters are not forgiving, and the animals had come from a managed environment with supplemental food and shelter. Natural selection began working on them immediately. Some did not survive. The herd was tested by cold snaps and deep snow events, by wolf predation, by the hard biological reality that captive raised animals arriving in a wild landscape have to learn, or fail to learn, how to be wild. Early population counts were cautious. Researchers flew surveys from small aircraft, photographing groups, tracking collared animals, measuring calf survival rates, watching body condition through the long winters. But the herd held, and then it grew. By 2021, 6 years after the original release, biologists counted 103 wood bison in the Inaco area, an increase of more than 10% from the previous year, with 26 calves joining the herd that season, the highest calf count the herd had ever produced. One researcher noted that having 100% survival of newborn wild animals from birth to midwinter in Alaska was, in his words, very uncommon. The animals were not just surviving. They were beginning to succeed. They were adapting to the landscape in ways that were measurable and accelerating. The wild-born calves of those original transported animals were now themselves becoming parents, passing on behaviors and adaptations that were specific to this particular valley, this particular river system, this particular northern ecosystem. In 2022, the project added 28 more yearling bison imported from Canada, the 28 animals that give this story part of its headline, flown into the valley and integrated into the existing wild herd. The combination of natural growth and that fresh infusion pushed the minimum count to 150 animals, a 45% increase from the year before. The researchers watching the population data were, by this point, using a word that does not come easily in conservation biology, success. But what was happening in the ecosystem around these bison was the part that had the wider scientific community paying very close attention. Because the story of what large herbivores do to a landscape is not simply a story about the animals. It is a story about everything else. When a bison walks through a grassland and grazes, it does not simply remove vegetation the way a lawnmower does. It selects. It moves in patterns shaped by millions of years of coevolution with the plant communities it feeds on. It grazes unevenly, creating patches of short grass alongside patches of tall grass, and those different heights of vegetation create entirely different habitats for entirely different species of birds and insects and small mammals. The thick-billed longspur, for example, nests in low vegetation that bison grazing maintains. Other grassland birds require denser, taller growth. A bison herd moving through a landscape creates both simultaneously, in a mosaic that no other grazing animal produces in quite the same way. Then there is the wallow. The bison wallow is one of the most consequential small-scale ecosystem engineering behaviors in the natural world. When a bison rolls in the earth, and they do this regularly, rubbing their enormous bodies against the ground to deal with insects, to shed their winter coats, to engage in behavior that serves purposes that researchers are still cataloging, they create a depression. Over time, with repeated use by multiple animals, that depression deepens. It collects water. It becomes a small pool, a microhabitat, a mini wetland that supports its own community of plants and invertebrates and amphibians and the birds that feed on them. Researchers studying bison wallows have found that they dramatically increase the diversity of soil microbial communities in grasslands, creating distinct pockets of different microbial life that collectively make the whole ecosystem more complex and more resilient than any uniform surface could be. And then there is the carbon. This is where recent research has moved the conversation about bison reintroduction from the realm of conservation sentiment into something that climate scientists and policymakers are now taking very seriously. A 2024 study from Yale University's School of the Environment, led by ecologist Oswald Schmitz, examined a reintroduction project on the other side of the world, in the Tarcu Mountains of Romania, where European bison had been absent for over 200 years and were reintroduced beginning in 2014. What the study found was striking enough that it generated significant attention across the scientific and policy press. A herd of 170 European bison, grazing across roughly 20 square miles of mountain grassland, was found to be drawing down an additional 54,000 tons of carbon from the atmosphere every year. That is the equivalent of the yearly emissions from approximately 43,000 gasoline-powered cars. And they were doing this not by doing anything unusual or extraordinary. They were simply being bison, grazing the grasses evenly in ways that stimulated plant growth and root expansion deep into the soil, recycling nutrients through their dung that fertilized the soil and the entire microbial community living in it, dispersing seeds across the landscape on their coats and through their digestive systems, and compacting the soil with their weight in ways that physically prevented stored carbon from escaping into the atmosphere. Professor Schmitz put it plainly in describing the findings. These creatures evolved for millions of years alongside grassland and forest ecosystems, and their removal has led to the release of vast amounts of carbon that was previously locked in the soil. Restoring these ecosystems can bring back balance. The bison, in other words, are not simply returning to a landscape that was waiting for them. Their return is actively restoring a biological process that had been absent for generations, pulling carbon out of the air and locking it underground in a way that the landscape, without them, cannot do. A follow-up report from Rewilding Europe noted that the grasslands in the Tarcu where the bison now grazed were capturing roughly 10 times as much carbon as they had been before the reintroduction. 10 times, not 10% more, 10 times more. A 2025 study published in the journal Science looked at Yellowstone's bison population, now numbering around 5,000 animals, and found that their seasonal migrations across the park's grasslands were improving soil microbe density, increasing nitrogen content in soils and plants, and restructuring plant communities in ways that cascaded through the entire ecosystem. These were not subtle effects observed in a controlled laboratory. They were documented, measurable. Replicable findings about the relationship between large animal movement and landscape health gathered from one of the most closely monitored ecosystems on Earth. Yellowstone's bison were providing scientists with a rare window into what the Great Plains may once have looked like at a functional level, and what large areas of degraded grassland around the world might look like again, if the animals that shaped them were given the space and the time to return. Back in Alaska, the wood bison story continued to develop in ways that were not always straightforward. The winter of 2022 to 2023 delivered a serious setback. An early heavy snowfall was followed by a brief warm period that melted the surface snow, which then refroze into a thick crust of ice. More snow fell on top of that ice layer. The result was a winter where the bison could not dig through to the vegetation beneath. McGrath, the nearest weather station, recorded a record 44 inches of snow still on the ground in mid-April of 2023, with snow persisting along the Innoko River until late May. The bison, whose biology is built for accessing forage by sweeping aside snow with their large, muscular heads, were defeated by the ice they could not break. Mortality was higher than any previous winter. The herd lost ground that had taken years to gain. This is the part of rewilding stories that tends to get left out of the inspiring documentaries and the optimistic press releases. The animals returned to a landscape do not simply find their groove and thrive in an unbroken upward line. They face what all wild animals face: hard winters, predators, disease, random catastrophic events that can undo years of progress in a single season. The wolf packs of the Innoko are real, and they have learned to exploit the bison's vulnerabilities in deep snow in exactly the ways you would expect predators shaped by the same evolutionary pressures to learn. An estimated quarter of the bison deaths in one difficult winter came directly from wolf predation, with additional losses attributed to the weakening that intensive wolf harassment delivers even when the wolves are not making a direct kill. The bison, for their part, still remembered the defensive formations their species had used against wolves for thousands of years, grouping the calves at the center, presenting their horns outward. But memory and physics are different things, and in deep snow in an Alaskan winter, physics has the final word. The researchers watching this were not crushed, exactly. Setbacks in reintroduction projects are expected and accounted for. What matters is the trajectory across years and decades, not the outcome of any single season. And the trajectory in Alaska, when viewed across the entire arc of the project, remained unmistakably positive. The herd had expanded into new areas of the Innoko. Drainage. Biologists tracking collared animals watched individuals explore territory stretched across a roadless wilderness, New animals were finding landscape features on their own, without guidance, navigating a country their ancestors had known, but that no living member of their species had walked in over a century. In 2024, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game released another group of bison, this time 58 animals, to establish a second wild herd in interior Alaska, building on everything that had been learned from the Innoko experience. The original project, launched with uncertainty and cautious hope in 2015, had generated enough data and enough demonstrated success to justify expansion. The wood bison restoration was no longer an experiment. It was a program. And it was working. The implications of all this reach well beyond Alaska, well beyond wood bison, well beyond the particular valleys and wetlands where these reintroductions are happening. What the bison story illustrates, in Alaska, in Romania, in Yellowstone, in the Banff backcountry, where 16 plains bison were released in 2017 and have since grown to over 100 animals, is a fundamental principle about how ecosystems actually function that conservation science spent a long time undervaluing. The principle is this: the large animals that evolved alongside a landscape are not simply inhabitants of it, they are engineers of it. They are part of its operational machinery. When you remove them, you do not simply lose the animals, you lose the processes they were running. The grassland that has no bison is not a bison-free grassland otherwise functioning normally. It is a grassland with part of its operating system removed. The soil is different. The plant communities are different. The carbon balance is different. The water retention is different. The microbial life underground is different. You can look at a degraded grassland and see grass and think grassland, but what you're actually looking at is a hollow version of what that ecosystem is capable of, running at a fraction of its biological potential, missing the intelligence of the animals that shaped it over millions of years. This is why a herd of 170 bison in a Romanian mountain range can capture the carbon equivalent of 43,000 cars. Not because bison are magical, because the grassland with bison operating inside it is running as a complete system, and the grassland without them was not. The difference between the two is not aesthetic, it is functional, and that function, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of degraded grassland that exist around the world, represents a carbon capture potential that no technology currently available to humanity can replicate at scale. The people who flew those first bison into the Innoko Valley in the summer of 2015 knew the science. They had read the papers, run the models, consulted with the indigenous communities whose oral traditions still carried the memory of what the land looked like when these animals were part of it. But there is a difference between knowing something and watching it become real. One researcher, describing his experience during the first aerial survey that found the herd thriving and growing several years after the release, said the feeling was not triumph. It was more like watching something that had been wrong for a very long time begin, slowly, to come right. The bison walked out of the transport containers and into the Innoko Valley. They grazed on grass that had not been touched by their species in 100 years. Their hooves pressed into the Alaskan soil. Their weight, nearly a ton per animal, settled into the earth in the way it had evolved to settle. Somewhere in the microbial community beneath the surface, processes that had been running at a deficit for a century began to shift. The birds that needed low-grazed grass would eventually find it. The wallows would eventually appear, slowly pressed into the earth by rolling bodies, beginning to collect water, beginning to become their own small worlds. The wolves would test and be tested, and the old dance between predator and prey that had not been performed in this particular valley in living memory would resume. None of it happened overnight. None of it was guaranteed. The hard winters and the ice layers and the mortality spikes reminded the researchers, every few years, that what they were doing was not management of a predictable outcome, but participation in a process that had its own logic, its own pace, its own costs. But the direction was clear, and the evidence was accumulating season by season, count by count, soil sample by soil sample, carbon measurement by carbon measurement, that the land knew what it was missing, that the absence of these animals had not been neutral, that the return of 28 bison, or 100, or 150, or 170 in a Romanian valley, or 5,000 in Yellowstone, was not simply an act of ecological nostalgia, it was an act of repair, a restoration of function, not just form, a reconnection of a living system to the engine that had been running it before anyone with a rifle decided the engine was worth more dead than alive. That is what stunned the researchers. Not a single spectacular moment, not a before and after photograph that fits in a social media frame. The quiet, patient, undeniable accumulation of evidence that when you return to a landscape what it lost, the landscape does not hesitate. It remembers, and it gets to work. There's a broader argument here that the bison story forces into focus, one that conservation science has been building toward for decades, but that is only now finding its way into mainstream policy conversations. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of nature conservation was essentially a museum model. Identify the species in danger. Build a fence around the area where they still exist. Protect what remains from further destruction. Do not lose any more ground. This model saved some species, in some places, from outright extinction, and it deserves credit for that. But it is a defensive posture. It conserves what is left rather than restoring what was lost. And it treats the natural world as a static thing, a collection of species to be kept in boxes, rather than a set of processes to be understood and supported. The Bison Project, and the dozens of other rewilding initiatives it represents and inspired, operate from a fundamentally different premise. The premise is that what was once whole can be made whole again, that the processes driving healthy ecosystems did not disappear when the animals were removed. They went dormant, or ran at reduced capacity, waiting for the conditions that would allow them to resume. That the relationship between a bison and the grassland it grazes is not merely historical or sentimental, but biological and ongoing, and that the grassland is, in a measurable sense, waiting for the bison to come back. This shift in thinking has been driven largely by data, and some of the most compelling data has come from places where rewilding has already happened and been rigorously studied. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone in 1995 generated a cascade of ecological change that researchers have spent 3 decades documenting. From the recovery of aspen and willow along the riverbanks to the restructuring of elk behavior to the stabilization of riverbanks to changes in the fish populations in Yellowstone's streams. The wolves did not simply add predators to the system. They changed how every other species in the system behaved, and those behavioral changes rippled outward in ways that no model had fully predicted. The technical term for this phenomenon is a trophic cascade, a top-down restructuring of an ecosystem triggered by the presence or absence of a keystone species. The bison story is the bottom-up version of the same principle. The bison are not predators. They do not change the system by making other animals afraid. They change it by doing the physical and chemical work that only they, in this particular landscape, in this particular way, have evolved to do. The Alaska researchers knew this going in, but there's always a difference between the theoretical prediction and the lived result. When biologists flew their annual aerial surveys over the Innoko in the years following the reintroduction and found animals in excellent body condition, found calf survival rates exceeding expectations, found the herd spreading into new drainages and establishing patterns of movement across the landscape that had not been seen there in 100 years, they were not simply counting animals. They were reading evidence that an ecosystem was resuming a function it had lost. Every calf that survived its first winter was not just a population statistic. It was proof that the experiment was working, that the risk had been worth taking, that the decade of regulatory work and community consultation and careful breeding and complicated logistics had produced something real. The Innoko bison are part of a story that is still being written. The herd will face more hard winters. It will face years when the wolves are strong and the snow is deep and the mortality is higher than anyone wants to see. It will face the political and economic pressures that accompany any wildlife project in a landscape where oil, gas, mining, and subsistence hunting are all also part of the picture. The researchers who started this project understood that returning bison to Alaska was not a conclusion, but a beginning. The beginning of a long, complicated, imperfect, necessary process of putting back what was taken. But here is what is already true, and what no setback can undo. There are wood bison in Alaska, wild ones, born in the Innoko Valley, knowing no world but the subarctic landscape their ancestors left 100 years ago, moving through it with the easy biological authority of animals, exactly where they are supposed to be. Their calves are nursing, their wallows are forming, their hooves are pressing into the earth in the dark of the Alaskan winter, breaking through the snow in the ancient way to reach the grass beneath. The soil under their feet is changing, molecule by molecule, in ways that scientists are only beginning to measure, and that will continue long after everyone who worked on this project is gone. The 28 bison that were flown into the Innoko Valley in 2022 did not know they were making history. They did not know they were part of a story about extinction and recovery, about ecological debt and scientific ambition, about what happens when human beings decide that what they broke deserves to be repaired. They stepped out of the transport containers, lifted their enormous heads, and smelled the air of a country their species had not stood in for a century. Then they walked into it, and the land, which had been running at half its capacity, which had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, recognized them and began, quietly and without ceremony, to become itself again.